then the blue go live button is waiting for us. And we're live. It is, I know, see how easy it is? Don't tell Ben, he'll be very upset. It is Monday, June 7th, 5:02 p.m. Eastern Time. I think we're all Eastern Time here, friends. And Scott, you have the monologue.
I do? No, I do not have the monologue.
You don't want the monologue?
No, I didn't. I wasn't prepared. I was told that there would be no cold calling.
Okay.
on the show. I have nothing. I have like nothing to say. I've just been working on my book, trying to finish it for next Wednesday. And
he's almost done with his book, Josh.
Yeah.
Next Wednesday.
Yeah, next Wednesday. That's when I handed it in. And the things I wrote a whole book, beginning to end, during the pandemic, and it was like
amassed like 45,000 more Twitter followers than he had before.
Exactly. So that's why I amassed them, because it was a way of not writing my book.
We all know. We know.
Yeah. I had very important things. I had very important things to say to the world, and the book had to wait. But but I'm. So you have the monologue. Go ahead.
Okay, no, you just did it. You did it. You did the monologue. Oh, Rosanna's here.
Okay.
I'm bringing in Rosanna. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Professor Josh Knobe of Yale University, and you were on my PhD committee, and Rosanna's coming in now. Rosanna, were you on Rosanna's PhD committee? I can't remember. Rosanna!
Oh my God!
Hi!
Rosanna, it's so good to see you.
So we're live, Rosanna. You're a little bit late, but that's totally fine, because this show is like the most impromptu, low-stakes thing ever. Welcome to In Lieu of Fun. It is a very lovely audience, and we just sit and talk about things like experimental philosophy and hang out. And I was about to introduce Josh, who does experimental philosophy and is the author, most famously, I think, on Wikipedia, of the Knobe Effect. And then I was also going to introduce you, Rosanna, Rosanna and I were at Yale at the same time. We worked with many of the same people because we were both doing cognitive science and psychology and law. Gideon Yaffe, Tom Tyler, Josh, Dan Kahan.
We met at a Josh Knobe lab meeting. Do you remember that, Kate?
That is. I was just saying. I was like, this is like it's going to be like a getting the band back together, except it's getting the lab back together. Yeah, it's super great. So thank you guys for coming on such short notice. This is super fun. Scott and I have talked about having you guys without your knowledge for a long time. We're like, Josh and Rosanna would be so great. So welcome.
Thanks for having us. I am not prepared to wow anybody, so I hope you didn't expect any, talk or anything. But Josh has some good stories that he can share.
No preparation. There's no preparation for this show. That's part of the thing. But I guess I want to really. Do you mind if I just start, Kate?
Yeah, go for it.
So I just I think for many people in the audience, they'll be kind of surprised to hear that there's this subject called experimental philosophy, because that sounds oxymoronic. And so maybe Josh, since you were, one if not the founder of this movement.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, right. Well, maybe you could just tell us, first of all, what is experimental philosophy, and who started it?
Well, experimental philosophy is this sort of relatively new movement that started at the beginning of the 21st century that aims at doing philosophy by actually running experiments, like experiments in the way that you would in cognitive science, where you're running experiments on people. So from really early in the history of philosophy, there was this idea that one way that we can make progress on philosophical questions is by thinking about kind of our intuitions about philosophical questions. So if you read, Plato's dialogues, he'll face you with some question like, what is justice? Well, let's consider this case. Would this be just? Would this be just? And then gradually you see the people in the dialogues are getting some sense about what justice really is. And experimental philosophy is very continuous with that really long tradition in philosophy, but it's something that's done experimentally. So instead of just saying, like, consider this case, surely you'd think the following thing about it. It's that we say, we gave 500 people this case. Participants were randomly assigned to one or another version that differed just in this one way. And then we can test really systematically, does this difference really make a difference in people's intuitions? So just in the same way that philosophers always have, we're studying these really deep conceptual questions, and we're doing it by using these thought experiments, but we're doing those thought experiments through systematic, quantitative, experimental studies.
I think the best way to get into experimental philosophy is to talk about the Knobe Effect, which is a really interesting effect, and it's also it's a
named
wild.
after Josh.
Yes, Josh. Josh has his own.
Although Josh always calls it the side effect and does not actually refer to it as the Knobe effect, which as everyone else calls it the Knobe effect, because it's so strongly associated with you, Josh, the discovery of the side effect.
Right, he could just call it the effect, the me effect, right? But the thing is that the story, how you came up with it, is wild, isn't it? I mean, to me, it's wild. First of all,
I think it's a great example.
Yeah, it's a great example, and also like the story about going to Central Park. That's what I mean. So why don't you tell about
that? Well, what Scott is getting at is that when I was a grad student, I had no funding because I was in a philosophy department. So I had no way to run studies in any normal sense. So the way I would run all my studies is by just walking up to random people in parks. So I would just walk up, because I had no money, I would just walk up to people as like a sad, scared grad student and be like, hey, I'm running a study. Can you just take a quick second and fill out this form? And then I ran all my studies throughout my whole graduate school career just by sort of.
How did you not get stabbed or pepper sprayed or anything? I don't understand.
So I didn't get stabbed or pepper sprayed, but I got offered a lot of drugs, a lot of drugs. But eventually some people were trying to buy drugs from me. But I wrote some rule that if someone tries to sell me drugs, they can't be in the same.
Now
valid.
Right, now I know why experimental philosophy has been so successful.
Oh man.
And a key part of the origin story is that you had haters, right, Josh? That people in philosophy were skeptical of this new approach, and so able to generate a little bit of buzz, and even record a music video of burning an armchair on fire. Is that where maybe your partner writes music or something like that? I don't remember all the details, but maybe the audience.
His partner writes music. In fact, I just discovered it today because it's linked to on Josh's website.
And did she write a banger about X-Fi?
Yeah, back when this movement was first starting, this was the age of MySpace, and then my wife, who was an indie rock musician, had a MySpace page, and then she was like, "You need a MySpace page for your philosophical movement," and then I was like, "Well, we can't have a MySpace page. We are serious academics trying to make And then she was just kept trying to beat me down to do it. And then finally she said, okay, I'll make a deal with you. If you make a MySpace page, I will write a song about experimental philosophy. And so then we did it. We made a MySpace page, and then she created this song, the X-Fi Anthem, which now has on YouTube a music video that consists of an armchair just going up in flames.
Okay, Scott, can somebody find
that link and post that? Yeah, okay, I'll find it.
I think Jonesy just put it on. No, he'll find, someone in the chat will find it. That is amazing. Okay, so hold on. Tell it. So you're walking up to strangers in the park. They're offering you drugs. They're not pepper spraying you. You because you're an ethical experimental philosopher, you're not counting the drug pushers in your study. Got it now. So how did you come up with the experiment for the Knobe Effect?
Oh well, originally this all started because before I went into philosophy, I was just like many people do as an undergrad. I was just working.
You were just a person?
I was a person. But as an undergrad, I was just running some studies, and Like I was someone's research assistant. His name was Bertram Malley. It was a really interesting.
Bertram!
You know Bertram?
I'm so close to Bertram. How do you know Bertram? Okay, sorry. We can't talk about that later.
When he was a grad student.
Really? He's a Brown
How do you know Bertram?
Because we're friends, because we both do human robotics and like blame study. Sorry. Anyway.
Oh. Wait,
Sorry.
no.
Yeah. Oh, we can talk about
When
it
he
later.
was I was his undergraduate RA.
That's so funny. I love him. He's great.
I agree. Yeah, he's awesome. And then so we were just running these studies that I just thought of as psychology studies. Then we published some of these results in a psych journal. And then I was like, okay, I'm leaving all of this. I'm leaving psychology. I'm going to go become a philosophy grad student. And then I'm going to, stop doing all that stuff, like running studies and whatever. I'm going to write about Nietzsche. So then I went to grad school, thinking I was going to do that. And then while I was in grad school, a philosopher actually wrote a reply to our paper. And then his name was Alfred Millie. He's a really great philosopher. And then he was like, taking our paper, that was just like, we thought of it just like an ordinary psychology paper, like any other one. And he was like, you could really think of this as philosophy. It's this paper about how people decide whether things were done intentionally. But you could think of that as a philosophical question. Like, let's treat this as philosophy. And so then he started going through different claims in our paper, and he was like, these things are right, these things are wrong. But then he was like, one thing to note about this paper is that it assumes throughout the whole paper that the notion of whether you did something intentionally isn't like a moral notion. It's just the notion of just whether you had certain kind of psychological states, like what you wanted, what you believed, what skills you had, and so forth. And then Mealy said, that view is just completely right. They might be wrong about some things, but they're just totally right about wrong. They might be wrong about other things, but they're totally right about that. And then I was very struck by his article. And then I was also had started to have this thought, like that thing he says that we're right about, I think we're really wrong about it. And then, but I had this thought, like, he's treating this as philosophy. Maybe if I can show we're wrong, I could publish it in a philosophy journal. So, yeah, that's the origin. Like, so I started thinking, if I can show that moral judgments are affecting judgments about whether you did something intentionally, maybe you could call that philosophy.
So what was the experiment? So one of the things that I just want to say is that I love about experimental philosophy is that, like, and Josh's work in particular, because you're very, very good at it, is the framing of a very, very controlled, elegant study. And also I would say, Rosanna, you also have this gift. You absolutely have this gift. I do not, because my brain is like full of I don't know, all of the detritus that is behind me on the bookshelf. But you guys are both so good at this. So what was the Knobe Effect study in particular? The one that Eugene Merman talks about in his video?
Okay, I can tell about it, but after I do, then can we switch to Rosanna? I just want to hear.
Yes. I think I would love it if you did that, and then like Rosanna talked about her consent work.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so in this study, we were suggesting that when people are just trying to figure out whether someone did something intentionally, like whether they did something on purpose, people's judgments about that are actually affected by their moral judgments, by whether they think what you did is morally right or morally bad. So participants in the study are randomly assigned to one of two conditions, and the two conditions are exactly the same, except for with regard to whether the thing that the person does is good or bad. So in the case where it's bad, participants are told, imagine the vice president of a company goes to the chairman of the board, and the vice president says, okay, we've got this new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, but it's also going to harm the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know this is going to harm the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So they implement the policy, and sure enough, it ends up harming the environment. And then participants are just asked, did the chairman of the board harm the environment intentionally? So did the chairman of the board harm the environment on purpose? And in that condition, most people say yes. So you might think that's just because he specifically knew it was going to harm the environment, and then he went ahead and did it anyway. But we thought maybe there's something more going on here, that maybe it's not just because he knew and he did it, it's because harming the environment is something bad. So we can tell whether that's true by making that case that's exactly the same, just word for word the same, except we're going to switch harm to help, so now it's going to be something good. So the vice president goes to the chairman of the board and says, okay, we've got this new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, and it's also going to help the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know this thing is going to help the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So let's implement the policy. So they implement the policy, and then sure enough, it helps the environment. And then participants are asked, did the chairman of the board help the environment intentionally? And there, participants overwhelmingly say no, the chairman didn't help the environment intentionally. But notice the only difference between the two cases is harm versus help. That difference, whether it's something good or something bad, it feels like the kind of difference that you think wouldn't have anything to do with whether something's intentional or not. It's just a moral difference, not a difference in the person's attitudes.
Yeah, so I just shared my screen. Hopefully people see this. This is one of the screens in the funny video that you posted that has like the survey results. So like people think harming is intentional, but people don't think helping is intentional. That just to visualize it for people, this is the asymmetry that Josh's experiment highlighted and what became known as kind of the Knobe Effect. And I'm going to post a link to this video in the chat as well. I mean, I think it's great. I actually just talked about it the other day. I think it comes up constantly. It's, I feel bad asking this because I probably should know it, but is there like, how many, do you know all of the different times that this has been like replicated with like tiny little changes, or like do you keep track of that? Like have people tried to, well, just like what ones interest you? Like, is it just a positive negative framing? Is it just like a is
harm
it
versus helping, moral versus immoral?
Exactly. Like, yeah, is it like you created something versus you destroyed something? Is it like that you did, like that type of thing? Like, is that like, or you could basically like, even though this is so clear and like with the harm versus help being the only kind of thing, you could then complicate, of course, harm and helping like a bajillion different ways, and try to figure out all of the ways that like maybe that is like a little bit more so I don't know, I don't even know if you do any work in this particular area anymore, if you kind of like left this behind since this was like, I think a while ago.
Wait, that's really helpful. But the thing that at least I think it is what attitude would be considered like the normal attitude toward the thing that you're doing. So is it that you're more into it than normal or less into it than normal? So if you consider harming the environment, kind of the normal attitude to have toward harming the environment is that you're trying to avoid it. And then people are sort of departing from what's normal. They're doing something weird by being kind of open to the idea of harming the environment. If you consider the idea of helping, the normal attitude toward helping the environment is to be like wanting to help the environment. And this person's kind of departing from the normal attitude toward helping in the other opposite direction, like of
Exactly.
being less of helping than you'd expect. So if you consider other things other than things that are morally bad, but are things that people usually don't want, then you should get exactly the same effect. So suppose that someone would naturally, like you might think people just naturally care about like getting credit for their work. Suppose you told someone, there's this thing, it would make the paper slightly better, but if you do that, then you'll be removing all credit that you'd get for the work. It will only be known as other people's work. And the person says, look, I don't care at all about getting credit for this work. Credit is just meaningless to me. All I want is just to make the paper as good as possible. So let's do this thing. And then they do it, and then sure enough, the person that ends up getting no credit for the work. Did he intentionally decrease the amount of credit that he got for the work? Then you should get the same answer, yes, even though that's not morally bad. Just because in the same way it's departing from the sense of what's normal.
Oh, really good explanation. Thank you.
Josh is like the answer machine.
I know.
That's really nice to hear. But yeah. I want to, because I think that Rosanna might have to leave soon. That's why I keep thinking.
Rosanna has to leave soon.
Yeah. By the way, Josh is not allowed to do that. It has to go through us first. Okay. Okay.
You mean the questions? Yeah, Rosanna.
Yeah, the questions.
Don't listen to Josh. Josh is canceled. Don't listen to Josh.
Mute Josh. Go ahead.
Josh is the most humble and like spotlight shy person. I feel like he's always saying, well, what do you think, when it's talking about like literally the Knobe Effect? Like, but yeah, I'm happy to talk about my experimental philosophy work on consent. We actually categorize it as a slight twist on experimental philosophy that we call experimental jurisprudence. This is like the legal corollary to experimental philosophy, where we're using techniques from psychology to examine legal concepts. So actually, intent is a good example. Intent is a philosophical concept, but it also has a specific meaning in the law. And you can look at how judges apply it. You can look at how juries cash it out. And you might think that some of Josh's research and research by other empirical scholars might bear on the question of like, what are juries doing when we ask them to decide intent? Or what's the doctrine doing when it treats this case one way and this case another way? And so inspired by the experimental philosophy movement, a couple of us have started doing the same thing, but with legal concepts. So in my case, I'm really interested in what ordinary people think consent is. Why does it matter? So in law and in philosophy, actually, there's this idea that consent matters because it can sort of transform or convert behavior that's normally not permissible and not legal, like going on someone's property or penetrating their body or taking their stuff, or like lots of different things you can think of. It transforms something that's normally not allowed into something that's totally fine. So with consent, I can come onto your property. That's called like going to your house for dinner. Without consent, that's called trespass. I'm a doctor. I take a little knife and cut into your body. With consent, that's called doing surgery. Without consent, that's actually called battery, right? So legally, it has this effect of transforming impermissible to permissible or illegal to illegal. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but that's kind of the idea of like why consent really matters. And I wanted to see how ordinary people think about that. And in particular, we have this idea, at least in theory, that just merely saying yes or nodding your head or tokening consent, as some people call it, is not actually enough to enact that transformation process. That's not like real consent, you could say. Rather, it has to be like autonomous consent. So like an example, meaningful consent. Not necessarily enthusiastic consent, that's a separate question, but like, is it genuine consent in the sense of, is it free? Is it informed? Are you competent? So examples where a person could say yes, but it doesn't really count as consent, and it doesn't have those downstream consequences of making something okay, would be like, you sign a contract with a gun to your head. And the question is that contract enforceable because you signed it and you said, sure, I agree to these terms? And the answer is no, the coercion has invalidated your consent.
I thought you were going to say that I have to say yes to a contract in order to listen to like an MP3 on like iTunes. And I was like, yes, I consent. Whatever you want, I have to listen to this song.
Well, yeah.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, that's another thing is like, do you consent if you click past if you like scroll past like a lot of like fine print and then just click yes? Is that real consent? Can you be held to the terms that you've agreed to without reading, that we kind of knew you didn't read, because like who can read that much? That's actually a controversial issue. The law generally says you do have a duty to read and you do consent in those cases. I mean, unless the terms are like unfairly hidden. That's a really hard question of when a yes is sufficiently free and informed and competent to like really count as consent. And I wanted to just see what ordinary people think. And so I was a law student. In fact, I was in a seminar co-taught by Scott and Gideon Yaffe, who's another legal philosopher at Yale. And they gave me like a little pot of money to write my seminar paper. And I just started out by giving ordinary people a bunch of consent scenarios. I did not walk up to people in the park. This was done online because
you used Mechanical Turk.
Yeah,
yes, I used Mechanical Turk, but I'm not insane. But
wait, don't knock Josh's like beta experimental philosophy. Like this is like okay.
All right, sorry, Josh. I was not as scrappy as you.
I think Rosanna had her own drugs, but whatever.
I know, right? Yeah, some of us don't have our own drugs, Rosanna.
So just in my initial poking around saying, well, what do people think of a scenario where someone, consents to sexual, relations while they're drunk? what do people think of a scenario where someone agrees to, have a surgery done because they're like lied to about how much it costs? What do people think about it? And just testing all these different scenarios. And a very clear pattern emerged that kind of diverged from the way that like philosophers had been thinking and bioethicists and law people had been thinking about it, which is that, like, yes, when it comes to people being put under threat, like coercion, people generally agree, okay, if you say yes under coercion, that doesn't count as consent. And when you have someone who's not competent to give consent or doesn't have capacity, so they're drunk or they're underage or they have some kind of intellectual disability, yeah, people are on board. That's not consent. It doesn't matter if they say yes. But there was this interesting divergence when it came to examples where the person was deceived. So I lie to you about something that I know matters to you. Maybe like I'm trying to get you to sleep with me and I lie to you about whether I'm single or married. And I know that you would say no to sex with me if you knew I was married, so I lie and say I'm single. In theory, that kind of deception should invalidate the consent because you haven't given consent to sex with a person who's married. You're giving consent to a single person, and this goes beyond the scope of your consent. And I'm taking advantage of you. And there are actually lots of different theories for why you might think that's non-consensual, but that's really not how ordinary people think about it. So I was finding when it comes to sex, when it comes to surgery, contracts, lots of different areas, people were saying that, you actually can be lied to by the person who's asking for your consent about something they know is important to you that would actually make you say no if you knew the truth. And that still feels like consent to ordinary people. Really surprising to me. But then when I started digging into it, it started to actually accord with a lot of the way that the law treats consent in many areas. So, for instance, it is not rape generally to lie about whether you're married, even to someone you know would refuse to sleep with you if they knew that fact about you. We don't generally treat deception as invalidating sexual consent unless it's super extreme forms of deception. So like there are only a couple of areas where that's taken to invalidate consent and constitute rape, at least under the common law. Really egregious examples, like if I impersonate the wrong person, like if I'm like pretending to be my twin or something, those are very rare cases, but in those cases, courts
really
say,
creepy. Yeah.
Courts will say, okay, that's rape. That's not consensual. Or if I'm like a doctor and I'm misrepresenting what's actually sexual touching as a medical procedure, that kind of deception, courts say, okay, that invalidates consent.
What about health information? Like, what about like an AIDS test or something?
So you lie about whether you're HIV positive or something like that? Yeah, so those can be considered, for instance, battery, like a sexual battery, if the person is deceived. But generally, the rationale there is that it's not because they violated your autonomy or your consent, it's because they've injured you and endangered public health. So the thinking there is not sort of under the classical rubric of like consent must be autonomous, it must be fully an expression of your will. It's sort of more like, well, we don't want people spreading disease. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting though. It is interesting.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things you said was really interesting, and I was wondering whether, like, how things are developing, because one of the things you can imagine something like experimental philosophy or experimental jurisprudence being either something confirming, like philosophical doctrines, or confirming the law, or being or an attempt to kind of reform it. I was wondering if is there a kind of consensus about that is forming about whether the folk judgments that are derived from these kinds of experimental methods accords with prior doctrine, both in philosophy and law? I mean, in philosophy it's so hard, right? Because nobody agrees on anything. But like, let's just talk about the law for a second. Is there a sense that the law is looking good here, or not?
I don't know if there's a consensus. I can talk about some of the different areas. So I've been talking a lot about my research on consent, where you do see interesting divergences with legal theory, but you also see interesting convergences where you're like, oh, the law actually wasn't as didn't take such a hard line on deception and validating consent as like the theory sort of said. And maybe these empirical results could explain why we see this kind of messiness in the law. But there's other research, like my friend Kevin Tobia, who's now an assistant professor at Georgetown Law, has been studying reasonableness. So this is a legal concept that is everywhere. What would a reasonable person do? And what's interesting about Kevin's research is that people, legal scholars, legal philosophers have been writing about what reasonableness means in the law for a long time. And there have been a couple of competing theories. One is that, okay, reasonableness really is meant to express like what the average person would do. It's kind of descriptive. Like if you just look at what most people do, that's like what reasonableness is supposed to capture. Whereas other people say, it's not really descriptive, it's more sort of normative. Like we want you to be reasonable, even if like most people would, I don't know, drive while texting. Let's hope that's not true, but let's just say in this society, most people drive while texting. It's not reasonable to drive while texting. And then some people say, like, that's kind of a hybrid. Like we want something that captures what like most people are doing, but also what we want most people to do. And what Kevin found in the experiments he ran, where he tried to ask ordinary people to determine how much of various different things would be reasonable. Let's say there's a contract and it says you have to return, you have to finish your job within a reasonable amount of time. How long is that? And he did a bunch of different scenarios, and he basically found that what ordinary people determine is reasonable is kind of like the arithmetic mean, or in between what people judge to be ideal, normative, and what people judge to be descriptive. So, if you say, okay, what's the normal amount of time to finish this job? People say, most people probably do it in, 3 weeks. What's the ideal amount of time it takes? Ideal would be 1 week. What's a reasonable amount? 2 weeks. So it's sort of in between. And then what is really great about Kevin's research is that then you can kind of go back and look at the different theories of what legal reasonableness is doing and see which match the ordinary view. And so that's where I see experimental jurisprudence. It's not really gonna be like yay or nay, is the law good or bad? It's sort of like, what are the different ideas or theories about what's going on in the law, and how does it line up with what is sort of intuitive to people?
I love Kevin's work. I will say he was also in our cohort, I would say, at Yale with like Rosanna and I. Yeah, we were all like kind of like hanging out in the same thing. We were in, I think we were both TAs at the same time to Tom Tyler's class. But anyways, it was, yeah. Kevin's work is so great, but it's experimental jurisprudence, experimental philosophy. I think that they're very exciting. They do kind of like lay I'm not saying that it's like an answer quantitatively to be able to kind of like count up the numbers of people that say this and to put them into some type of statistical kind of array. But I will say that like, as kind of Josh explained at the beginning of this, that like kind of like narrowing these questions is like a very ordered way of going about approaching these problems that seems to make a lot of sense. Like it seems like a great idea to start with like doing a survey like you did, Rosanna, about consent, and then to spend like the next 10 years like narrowing various questions and various avenues. Sorry, I just like kind of like took over your research agenda for a second. But
I think what's important is that we don't really, or at least I don't really see myself as trying to say like the law is right or wrong, or whatever ordinary people think, that's what we got to do, man.
People I don't like that. People like you to have a normative take.
It's just, people sometimes think things that we really don't want to instantiate. I mean, think about all the empirical research on like implicit bias or that sort of thing. It's not, just because something is intuitive doesn't necessarily mean we want to like codify it. But I still think it's interesting and instructive to find out what the ordinary view is, to the extent there is an ordinary view. And by the way, it's not just consent and reasonableness. Like people have been, including Josh and Scott, have looked at how people think about causation, another important legal concept, how people think about ownership, property, various concepts that come up. And I wish I could give you, Scott, an overall kind of summary that we found a lot of convergence between the law and ordinary views, or we found a lot of divergence. But I think it's going to be a hodgepodge. It's going to depend on the construct. It's going to depend on whose explanation of the law you're looking at when you're comparing the law against the lay view. Maybe there's a chance to talk about your proximate cause research? Or am I not allowed to call on them like this?
No. Yeah, you're not. You're absolutely not. But I want to put Josh on the spot right now. Okay.
Rosanna, also, like, you don't have to say bye, but you can say bye. But like, whenever you have to go, just like let us know.
Okay, this is so fun.
Yeah, isn't it fun? I know. Don't say that. It's in lieu of fun. Sorry.
It's in lieu of fun. Right. This is in lieu of vacation, right, for you, Rosanna. So Josh, I'm going to put you on the spot right now. Okay. So Josh, when you said 10 years, I know Josh winced because I made Josh wait 10 years to finish our paper. We started in 2010 and we finished in 2020. It took us 10 years to write this paper. And like every 6 months I would get like a email from him. It's like, hey, Scott, like, remember that paper we're writing? Maybe we could finish it because it would be really cool to finish it.
I've worked with Josh on things, and that is exactly how he writes an email.
Yeah, he would say, hey, remember our great paper? How irritating was I?
Actually, it was super fun. I actually had a really great time writing that paper with you.
Yeah. You know what the hardest thing was? I'll tell you what the hardest thing was. They were said like, so this is what Josh and I did, okay? So Josh had this, we met in 2010 at like for lunch, and he was telling me about his basic view, which is that for many concepts that we think are purely descriptive, like intention, intentionality, and he also mentioned cause, that they're not fully descriptive, but they have a normative aspect to them, and they have a kind of either statistical normality or moral normality. So whether something is considered a cause or not depends in part on not just like, you know, descriptively what the causal relations are between the two, but rather, was this normal? Was this a normal thing? So, for example, like if you thought it was what the action that the person did was abnormal, you're more likely to say that action was the cause of the harm. And so when I heard this, I thought, oh my God, this is excellent, because this would be a solution to the problem in legal theory about proximate causation, because you had two views on proximate causation. You had one view which said, like whether something is a proximate cause of a harm is a purely descriptive notion. And then nobody could ever figure out what that descriptive notion was. And,
yeah, I'm just going to really force you for 1 second for everyone that's watching this that has never engaged in this idea before. Can you just give a quick example of what a proximate cause is?
I'm so sorry. Yeah, no. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. So for example, if I come up and I hit you over the head with the baseball bat, and you get a concussion and some injury in your head, then you say, not only did I cause your concussion, but like I was the proximate cause of it. Like I was really close to harming you. Whereas when my mother gave birth to me, that's a cause of you getting a concussion, but it's so far removed. It's not proximate to the concussion.
Like you existing, basically. Your mother giving birth to you, so you existing is like so far away. So it's like the Paul's graph kind of like, just to like, for people who are not familiar, there's a classic torts case, which is just like a guy is like walking with a box of fireworks on the Long Island Railroad, and a rope breaks that's holding a weight, and the weight crashes into I don't remember the thing.
No, what happened was that it's an unbelievable story. I
don't teach torts. I'm just trying to remember from one else. So go ahead. It's
an incredible story. It's like the worst philosophical hypo because it's so complicated, but this has actually happened. So the railway, the subway, the train worker pushed the lady. Mrs. Paul's pushed the guy. Yeah, right. Pushed the guy into the train to get them in because the doors were closing. He was holding fireworks. That falls down, makes a big boom, and then something falls down on Mrs. Paul's graph on the other side of the platform, and she claims that the worker that pushed the guy in was a proximate cause
That's
of
right.
her
Sorry,
thing.
thank
right?
you. Yes,
right.
I was just like,
So
but
the question
basically,
was-
it's an attenuated cause of something.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So like if you read the cases, they're just like all over the map. Like you cannot figure out one way or another, like whether the court is going to say it's a proximate cause or not a proximate cause. And so a lot of people, known as legal realists, would say this is all bullshit. Really, what the court is just saying is, do we want to hold this person responsible or not? So causation here is just like a kind of a joker, a wild card that allows somebody to basically just say, the court to say, in this case, we want to hold this person responsible. We're going to say that this is is the proximate cause. And so I thought at the time, this is perfect. So what we could do is we could use Josh's notion that causation is both descriptive and normative. In order to show that these judgments of proximate cause in these cases actually came out according to our ordinary notions of causation, because our ordinary notions of causation are neither purely descriptive or purely normative about who should be responsible, but they're like some combination, much like what Rosanna said about consent or reasonableness, but Kevin thinks about reasonableness, that is some kind of middle ground between the descriptive and the normative. And so it turned out there was it started 10 years of like lots and lots of studies and stuff to try to show how it worked, and we finally published it at the University Chicago Law Review.
That's a really hard. I mean, like I've had like
an
idea that like that would be something that you would test,
crazy.
but it seems insane.
Yeah.
Josh, did you?
So, well, was I irritated? How irritating was it?
Answer Scott's neurotic question.
Scott is a very delightful co-author. Anyone in the audience who has ever co-authored something with Scott will know how delightful it is.
We'll take that as a yes.
But I'm really happy. I mean, like, I think that the experimental jurisprudence, like, Josh, you seemed very into it. You took in a lot of people, I would say. We joked about it once, but you took in a lot of people from YLS, from the Yale Law School, that were kind of damaged, or like, not damaged, but like refugees, I would say. Like, they were just like, I think that they were just kind of like, and I remember telling you, I was like, this is the best part of my day is coming to like, the best part of my week is coming to the lab. And like, people have such great ideas and are so interesting. And I'm not competing with any of these people, and I can just like accept, like, let this all wash over me. And it's so generative, and it would just be like amazing. And I don't know, like, do you think, like, you've, like, had a hand in a lot of, like, kind of legal, and kind of this new wave of experimental jurisprudence? Do you think that it's, like, a way forward? Do you think in these terms now, even though you're not, like, a lawyer?
Well, yeah, I feel like it's kind of above my pay grade. Like, I feel like I really feel like I feel a little bit reluctant to weigh in on these questions about jurisprudence. But I didn't know if I'm allowed to ask about the thing you were saying about YLS. Like, I mean, is that getting too far off topic? Or it sounds like the way you were talking about it, like something kind of bad was happening on YLS.
Oh, no, I just meant like that time. Oh, nothing bad was happening at YLS.
Well,
I just meant like, it was a very like, I just mean law school is kind of like a cutthroat environment to be in versus like kind of like the lab group that I think that you, and I was just kind of, it was less a comment about YLS. I mean, YLS was kind of like, it was more a comment of what an inviting and lovely and incredibly generative and supportive environment you created, Josh, than like a comment on YLS. It was really like, it was really lovely. And I think that
I wonder. Oh, sorry. I wonder if it's something about not about me in particular, but it's kind of about this discipline. Like, there's the sense, I don't know, in cognitive science, you're just supposed to kind of work together and try to figure stuff out. I didn't know if maybe there's this difference, like this idea that we're all like working together to find the right answers to these questions. It's a very common cognitive sciencey attitude, but maybe different disciplines kind of different, and then somehow it's more agonistic, like we have to defeat our opponents and be the best student.
That is not, I would say that was a scientific mindset I found incredibly refreshing and lovely, and that I did not enjoy while I was in law school, and I in fact miss desperately. Yeah.
but maybe you can create like a pocket of that now, like with your students. The kind of thing that you're doing of like there's more ethnographic stuff. Can you create like an oasis of collaboration in the law school?
Yeah, I can. I don't think in this law school. I mean, but like life is long, and so we'll see. But like I think that like, but I mean, I say not in this law school just because it's a small law school, and like it's just there aren't people that are interested. There are not enough students that are interested in kind of like what I do is for kind of academic purposes. But yeah, I mean, like I just think that it's an interesting. It's also like an interesting thing that I've observed. And I would wonder, Scott, what you would have to say about this, knowing Josh and other people in other like kind of departments and philosophy departments. Like Josh and Gideon and like some others have been some of the most like people that are not from a legal discipline have been some of the most generous people in terms of time and energy and like pushing forward and creating spaces for those types of things. And it's like I think it's a real like loss that like the legal academic kind of society doesn't have that for students and for graduate students that want to go into academia or go into something because like related to academia, because I just kind of feel like it's like you have to publish your paper by yourself on your own, place it really well, defend it really well, be like it has to fit this kind of like, whereas I feel I enjoyed the flexibility in thinking of like
I would just say that like part of the thing in any environment is people get excited about the new thing. I think this is in some sense what one of Thomas Kuhn's great insights, which is that people pick theories not because they do better jobs explaining the evidence, but because they have the promise eventually of doing it. And I think in different areas, like I think like 30 years ago, that was the case in law schools about law and economics. People thought, oh, this is really exciting. This is a new thing. And communities formed around law and economics. And I think what Josh did is that he,
but you too, Scott. You've supported this too.
Yeah, but so I would just say that like Josh, a very charismatic guy and also a very friendly guy. And he just kind of was like.
He also has drugs.
Yeah, it also has drugs. And, and so there's a sense of like, oh, this is this new thing. We can make progress. And that's just a very exciting thing, for anyone. Because, at the end of the day, so many people have done the same thing over and over again that you want to do something new. And when somebody's super smart and charismatic and just really open and collaborative, that's just really exciting, and they're going to flock to them. And that's exactly what's happened with Josh.
So I will just say that when I met Josh for the first time, I was very, 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 very nervous. We had a bunch of friends in common. I don't know if you remember this, Josh. And we met at Maison Matisse in New Haven. And I was a resident fellow at ISP, and so I was like unclear, and I was trying to decide what to do, whether to do the PhD program or not. And I was like, I remember just like literally reciting to you all of the papers that I had read in cognitive science, and then like being like, can you tell me what philosophy I need to read to be a philosopher? And like you just like looked at me and you were like, and you were the kindest, most gentle person, and we're like, you don't need to do any of that. What are you interested in? And I was like, you don't care what I'm interested in. I haven't proven myself to you yet. I need to like read all this philosophy. And like, it was, I don't know. It was just like, I remember that. So like, I came out of that and I was like, both like, I'm an idiot, but also maybe that's okay. Like, because that's what you're supposed to be at this stage of everything. Wait. And so like, thank you.
I feel like you yourself always create this feeling, like this vibe of like, we're all in it together, we're working together. Do you feel like that there are things that people can do in law schools to make law schools more like that? Like, I really feel like you are making things like that, but is there something that we can do, to make things more that way?
we have to get to questions in a second, but I'm gonna say that like yes, and I think that like the thing is like not something that people want to hear, but it's like it kind of like comes down to like being a real person and like breaking down the moments where you've had these types of like really like hey, and so like as when I was in college, one of the things that I did was like create a mentoring program for women coming out of Brown, and like women coming out of Brown were like all becoming writers and like doing things where they were poor, and like none of them were getting jobs in Wall Street or consulting firms, and it was because all the consulting firms would go to the fraternities and like do job like so that I tried to create a pipeline that would like give people like the power to kind of take these like higher paying jobs and like kind of stage it with like if you care, like, you know, money will be power someday and like whatever, give you freedom. But I guess like that one of the things that also hit me as I was doing that and spending so much time with like all these high-powered women was that like there is like this sense that you have to keep up this like magisterial self, like this self that is like very like performative, in which you have it all together and everything's fine. And I think it's really damaging to like people, especially women who are like coming, or any, and like people of color who are coming up and don't realize how like human like they are, and they went through all of this. And if you talk to them and sit down with them, they'll tell you, but they don't publicize it. And I feel like when I publicize my human and authentic self, I get a fair amount of like kind of like, wow, you're so out there on like, I don't really actually think I'm that out there, but they're like, you're so out there on like Twitter or whatever. But I actually think it'd be really great if like more men were out there on Twitter and like and kind of like did this type of thing. Like I think it's really, I think that I mean it's a weird line to walk, but I just think that I just think it's really beneficial, and when you're doubting yourself and you're young, it helps so much. Does that make sense? Yeah. Richard. Sorry, Richard, I forgot about you for a second. We got carried away. I like your shirt, Richard. It's not the uniform, but I'll take it.
I was forgotten but not gone, so I guess I can be happy with that. So I'm going to preface my question by saying that this is not a question about disciplinary boundaries. It's more a question about which kind of scientific community you're working in. But I'm curious about what distinguishes the questions in experimental philosophy from those one associates with empirical social science inquiries, or is that distinction even meaningful?
More the second, that it's not very meaningful. Like, so it feels like, sorry, the answer is the second answer, that it's not very meaningful. Okay. So it feels like in a number of different areas, there will be two people from different disciplines who are working on the same question, and they come at it from different traditions, with different backgrounds. Mm-hmm. But the question's really the same, and there's a single community working on them. So if you consider psychology and economics, there are certain questions that are kind of at the intersection of psychology and economics. And there's a community of people working on those questions from either of the two disciplines. And I feel like there's some subtle way in which you can feel like the people in those different disciplines are different, right? They have different knowledge when they're in grad school. They study different things. They come out of different traditions. But you wouldn't say there's some really deep sense in which these are just totally different fields, and there's econ and psych, and then we should just make a really big distinction between them. And I feel like what's happening in experimental philosophy is something really similar. So there are these certain questions we're trying to understand. For example, what's people's concept of consent, of causation, of intention? And then there are people working on those questions from philosophy and people in psychology, and they're working together on these same questions. But there's still some difference. Like the people in philosophy have read a lot of Aristotle and thought a lot about logic, and they're coming at it with a certain background, a certain tradition that maybe makes them think about it in slightly different ways.
Yeah, that was well said. I think that's right. I wonder, like, the interdisciplinary question is like a great one. I don't know if that's like you could like spend like 8 episodes like in lieu of fun on that, but yeah. Matteo has like 20,000 questions. Matteo, have you taken a class with Josh?
I've not, but I've been a fan of his work for a couple months.
Matteo is a Yale undergrad. Yep.
Hey,
and
hey, professor.
And
by the way, I just think it's so cool that you said I've been a fan of your work for a couple of months.
Sorry.
Which
I
is
think
that's
a
great.
while.
Wait,
No,
hold on.
for an undergraduate, that's I mean, it's unbelievable, but it's funny.
Okay, can I just really, sorry, Matteo, but I'm just
Sure.
really briefly going to say something that I've been thinking about for a while, Josh and Scott, which is the idea that like we do not measure age correctly based on like the developmental like ability of memory and consciousness to develop. And so, I mean, I'm not talking about Gideon's work about kind of like consent and ability to consent and like kind of like your ability to like judge risk. I'm literally just talking about memory, which is why I think that like everyone in their teens, in addition to having like a lot of hormones, actually have a lot of hormones and no sense of relativity, because they're just like have literally everything is such a big deal because they have like 5 years of like lifespan to judge it by. Like, and so no, I'm serious.
No,
and like and so he
No, I
said a
totally
couple
do.
of months, and I think that this is like, well, if you're like a fucking no offense, like if you're like in college, like no, like this is like how I used to think about things. I remember trying to
that's why
quit my
time,
first job in
goes
6
by
weeks.
Faster when you're older. Like when you're 10, a year is 10% of your life, but when you're 40, it's like 2%.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
good point. Yeah.
anyway,
Thanks for digging in the knife there, Matteo.
Sorry about that.
Mateo, you have 8 million questions. You can pick 2.
I'll pick the top 2. The first question is whether experimental philosophy really is a new thing. Like, it seems to me that we've been doing thought experiments to investigate philosophical concepts for forever. Gettier comes to mind. And so do you think that this is just a recent designation that's based off of like, statistical rigor and psychological best practices, or is it just a label that we should be applying to like Descartes or older philosophers?
Yeah. The second one is the right answer. So it feels like if you look back, in the 19th century, you see these figures like Nietzsche or Feuerbach or Mill, who are really interested in these psychological questions. They're interested in the question, what's actually going on empirically in people's psychology that is leading them to have the thoughts that they do about questions in morality, questions about causation, and so forth. And then that thing that you see in the 19th century wasn't new to the 19th century. You see that in these early modern philosophers like Hume or Locke. You see it going back even to the earliest days of like ancient Greek philosophy. You see figures like Aristotle making really clear empirical claims. At the time that I was a grad student, people very strongly denied that any of that was relevant to philosophy. So at the time there was this sense philosophy is this thing that's purely concerned with questions that have nothing to do with human psychology, nothing empirical. So I would say, I'm interested in these questions, and then someone would say that's not philosophy at all, and I'd say the question I'm working on is the exact question that's in Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. The whole first book is about that question, and they'd be like, well, that just shows that Hume's treatise isn't about philosophy. So at least I think, but in a way that this thing that experimental philosophy is, it's not something new. It's just a return to the old thing. It should be seen as retro, like I don't know, the Black Keys or something like that. That it's an attempt to like return. Well, maybe like the Black Keys in that, just as the Black Keys were sort of return to the blues, but adding these new elements of 21st century rock and roll.
This kid has no fucking clue who the Black Keys are, Josh. What are you doing?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Josh, why don't you talk
kind
about,
of like
Josh, why don't you talk about the Jack Parr show?
what?
Wait,
Yeah.
I'm terribly sorry.
Yeah.
But,
Oh my God,
is
is that over people's head? Like
That was over my head. That was over my head.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh my
And
God.
I'm with you on MASH most of the time. Why didn't you make a MASH? Anyways, Matteo, the Black Keys were basically a band that like kind of went back to like jazz roots and like were kind of great. And so like what Josh was saying was that the Black Keys were kind of like that. But then, sorry, go ahead, Josh.
she's totally got it. Yeah.
Yeah, but then basically like they went back to the roots, but then they pushed it forward in all of these new ways, and that this is the cyclical nature of scholarship.
Mhm. Okay, makes sense. Maybe Richard sometime will give a music history lesson and I can fill out.
I just gave you the music history lesson. What the fuck do you want?
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm just kidding. What's your second question?
My second question is just, I've noticed that the question of whether or not something is natural seems to come up a lot in a variety of different areas, whether it's what substances an athlete is allowed to use to compete, or what behavior should be made illegal by the state, et cetera, et cetera. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or aware of any research on what affects naturalness judgments.
Yeah.
That's a really good question.
We should work on that exact question if you wanted to work in experimental philosophy.
That would be amazing.
We tried.
Mateo, you just signed yourself up.
I'm psyched. You have no idea.
The only thing that we've done on that issue, but I don't think this doesn't really answer your question, is
Sure.
we were interested in the question, suppose that someone acts one way online, like when they're texting you or emailing you or like writing Twitter posts or something, and then they act another way offline, like when they actually meet you.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could ask which one of those reveals who the person most truly is.
Mm-hmm.
And then people really strongly think it's whatever you are offline. And it's a striking fact because over time our life is becoming more and more online. More and more of what people actually do in interaction with each other is like texting each other, not like actually hanging out with each other. But people think that it's what you do offline that reveals your true self. And then I'm trying, why is this happening? And then in a whole series of studies, we found the thing that seems to really predict which thing reveals your true self is which thing people see as like the most natural way for things to be. So if you mention like different ways you could fight like a war or something. One is you have like drones and you're in some room like controlling them with your keyboard, and the other is you're on like a battlefield with like swords and so forth. People think it's the second one that sort of reveals who you really are, what you do in that context, because that's like the natural way to be. Like if you're in some forest or like away from the city or something, what you do there is the natural thing. But then I don't think that answers Mateo's question, because Mateo's question is about like what makes that the natural thing? It feels like it's somehow connected with how things used to be. Like what the natural environment for humans is the not like
Scott, are you thinking about natural law in the way that I'm thinking about natural law?
I wasn't thinking that, but that's a great. That's actually a really interesting insight.
Yeah.
No,
I was just thinking. I was thinking that like so. Okay, so well, I have two thoughts. One is that, to be honest, Josh, I think you're talking about authenticity, in a way. So just because I know your lab, I think you're talking about authenticity as a proxy for natural. That I don't think that Mateo's question is necessarily getting to, although it's interesting that they're proxies, but maybe not. I don't know. And then the other thing is that like that I'm kind of trying to hold in my mind is like whether the idea of natural law, which is like this idea that there is some type of like from on high, like natural moral law that like kind of comes down from nature, is like, and that like no one can explain or really, but is like this this undefined thing that people can appeal to or base things in or whatever. And like that being kind of something that like Mateo's question kind of speaks to, but I don't know. I'm also just like this is really interesting. Mateo, I'm very happy that you asked these questions. They're really good questions.
I'm happy to ask these questions. And actually, it was interesting, Professor, that you brought up that specific example, because one of the things that got me thinking about this was a conversation I had with a vegetarian about under what circumstances it's fair to go hunting. And the question was, well, is it fair to use a gun, or is it fair to use a knife, or is it fair to just use your bare hand? And the intuition seemed to be that knives and bare hands were okay, but guns and drones weren't. But we had a really hard time teasing that out.
Dude, that's an amazing example.
Yeah.
That is it. I was just going to
like you just fucking wrote a really, 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 like you don't realize it, but that all you have to do is like literally create the counterfactual for that in the narrowest sense and like pose it as a question on MTurk, and it would be like great.
Yeah, maybe I'll go out
Right?
to the park as soon as COVID's over.
Okay, Josh and Mateo, well, Mateo, you have to send me your email address, but Josh and Mateo will connect you guys. But this was really great. I'm really glad you came in, Mateo. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for
Yeah,
having
this
me.
a wow. We should start an in lieu of fun paper series.
I know.
You know?
I've thought about it. No one wants to read our papers. Everyone's here for the video content.
Yeah.
Josh, can you come back literally any time? This was so fun. This was like the
It was
best day. This was so great. I mean, like Rosanna was
unbelievable.
amazing.
Rosanna's
I mean-
amazing. Rosanna's amazing. And
She's
it
so
was wonderful to
good.
be here.
She's
it's
so
not supposed to be
stupid
fun.
good. She's really the real deal. I know.
But I know this wasn't supposed to be fun, but just in lieu of fun, but it actually is pretty fun. Okay, I'll keep that under wraps.
We can't have fun anymore.
Oh yeah, we'll be back 22 hours and 53 minutes from now, and until then, Scott.
We can't have fun anymore, but we can have Josh and Rosanna to not only enlighten us, but even make us chuckle, but not in a fun way.
In a really sad way.
Really
sad chuckles.
But I know this has been crazy good. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
and,
Josh.
and thanks to the chorus. Great questions, great comments. This is always so much
Thank you
fun.
for the
Thank you.
invitation.
It was so great
Okay.
to see you. See you guys.